Okay, well, hello, South Pontotoc High School students. Today I was going to do a little lesson on modification, part of our study of grammar and language skills. I'm going to show you today 5 kinds of non-clausal modification. Now, this is a little unusual, maybe. We tend to think of modifiers oftentimes in more of a word by word, like adjective, adverb sort of thing or kind of way. And this gives us just a little bit different take on that and just opening up some new options, maybe that you haven't thought of, or maybe have seen them, read them, or even studied them in the past, but it just gives us a different look. First kind that we could use as just one of many, many tools for modifying other sentence structures. It's called the noun cluster, and I have it abbreviated here with NC, noun cluster. And it is just exactly that. It's something that clusters around a noun. So the focus of modifiers of any sort, whether it's a single word or whether it's a phrase or whether it's a clause, is to really hone in on one particular structure, whether it's the subject or whether it's modifying the verb or whether it's modifying some other word within the sentence. In this case, see if you can read the sentence and then determine what it is that's being modified, what's being altered or changed, or what's having meaning added to it or description added to it. Okay? I'll read it just as you did. The soldiers crouched behind the rock wall, tired young men with great courage. So, what is it that's happening here? Well, we're using one noun, men, basically as a renaming type modifier. It's not replacing it, it's not taking anything away from it. Instead, by addition, by alteration, by modification, that's our word, we add meaning or a new look at the original subject of the sentence, the soldiers. So look at it again. The soldiers crouched behind the rock wall, tired young men with great courage. And all this really does is provide us with one other kind of structure. It's not a clause. Why? Because it doesn't have a subject and a verb in it. It's not just something we might call a phrase, because really, it doesn't do anything other than anything specific other than describe in a new way these soldiers. That's all it does. So it's a cluster of words, you might call that phrase, that clusters around this one noun. All right, the second kind of non-clausal modification is called a verb cluster. And we abbreviate that with VC. A verb cluster is just like it says. It's going to use words clustered around a particular verb form to again modify one portion or one part of this main clause. Here's the main clause. I'm going to use the same main clause in all of these examples, all 5 of these. The soldiers crouched behind the rock wall, looking for the sniper. Okay, and there's your verb. It's called a present participle. It's an ing. You know it's a participle because it's not the standard form of the verb, like look or looks. It's not a past participle like looked. Instead, it's something happening in the now. and perhaps continuing to happen, which is why we use this spelling, the ing spelling, the present participle. And that gives us another way to use not an entire clause, but instead just a phrase or a cluster of words around a particular component that we're familiar with, like a verb or like a pair, like a noun, something pretty easy to work with that can really mature one's writing. And like in this case, and here again, looking for the sniper is a way that we add meaning to soldiers, right? What they're doing. Okay. The third kind, the adjective. It's a single word. Or like this, it can be a series of single word modifiers. We call it an adjective series. And in this case, it's written sort of like a journalistic kind of punctuation here with the commas. And I'll explain that in just a second. But again, we have our main clause, the soldiers crouched behind the rock wall, weary, hungry, and wet. And all these words are doing, they're describing, additionally describing things that we know about these soldiers, or that the writer wants us to know about the soldiers. It just expands the imagery, expands the description. That's really what we're looking to do here, to mature our writing, to take it from something simplistic and make it something more interesting. So weary, that describes soldiers. Hungry describes soldiers, and wet describes soldiers. Now, you can imagine that scene in your mind, and that helps, with thinking about comprehension skills and how we grow those on our own through practice. All right, forgive me, the air conditioning just popped on, so maybe a little bit harder to hear, but I'll try to speak up a little bit. So again, notice the way these three words, weary, hungry, and wet, are listed in a series. We might traditionally think that, if we have three items in a series, we're going to put a comma after the first one and after the second one, but not anywhere near the third one. And in a traditional or conventional kind of thinking, we would do that. A lot of today's writers, especially writers of fiction or writers of journalism, even on social media, essayists, bloggers, they oftentimes don't include what some might refer to as this Oxford comma, this conventional next to last uh, modifier, having a comma after it. And that's up for debate. Some of us stick to that very strictly. Some people don't. And, that's a matter of the situation I guess you find yourself in. If it's something that your teacher is going to require, do it. If it's something that, if you ever take a journalism class that you're taught not to do for the sake of space on a page that's printed, like in a magazine or in a newspaper or on a website, then of course, journalists don't typically use it. Everyone else in the English world, at least of my generation and before, we typically do keep that comma. All right, anyway, enough about that. The fourth kind of non-clausal modification is called an absolute construction. And that may be something you've not yet heard of. I know my English 3 students have heard of this. We've talked about this and used it quite a bit. It's something that's kind of unusual sounding if you're not used to reading them, if you haven't had as much experience reading fiction or those sorts of things. Take a look. The soldiers crouched behind the rock wall, their rifles pointing toward the road below. That almost sounds as if this is a run-on sentence with one clause here at the beginning, the main clause, and another clause right after it. And technically, that's almost what we have. There's one little thing missing, though, and it's right here after rifles. If the word were, that's the verb, W-E-R-E, were, which is a form in the past tense of the infinitive to be, one of several different forms of that verb, be. Think about it. We have am, is, are, was, were, be, being, been, B-E-E-N. All of those different forms or spellings of the word point back to and mean literally to be. It's a statement of existence. That's the word that we use in our language uh, to capture that idea that something exists or that it exists a certain way. Typically, we always go beyond just the statement of its existence. Like their rifles don't just exist, but they're actually doing something. Their rifles were pointing toward the road below. That would be a separate clause. It would be an independent clause. And if that were the case, we would have a run on sentence because the first independent clause and the second independent clause would not be joined correctly because that would be a comma splice right there. That one comma right between them. And that's a grammatical error, a punctuation error. So, in this case, we're using something slightly altered. We're using everything except that form of to be. And we know that we're talking about a past tense time frame. The soldiers crouched. That past participle spelling of crouched introduces us to that time frame in the past. Okay? By adding everything that would normally be in the clause except for the form of to be, in this case, the verb were, we simply get basically a structure that becomes a modifier. It's something that just describes something in the original clause. And in this case, absolutely, that's what's happening. Their rifles pointing toward the road below all functions as one structural unit modifier that is uh, growing or developing the description of whom. That's right, the soldiers. And that's what an absolute does. Now notice, as expected with the adjective series, I've abbreviated it ADJ, like I would a single adjective or multiple. And with the absolute, I've abbreviated it ABS. And so that's something different, something that you might find new to you, and that's okay. But it is something that really adds a level of maturity to writing when you're trying to describe something in a different kind of way or an interesting way. Something that's very clear to imagine, very easy to use. Again, one more tool in our toolbox of writing skills. And then finally, something that's familiar to most every one of us, and that's a prepositional phrase. Now we can use that just like we've used these others. With our main clause here, the soldiers crouched behind the rock wall with pride, courage, and determination. And everything from the word with all the way to the end makes up our prepositional phrase. And it's the fifth of these five kinds of non-clausal modifications that we can make and very simply really grow our writing into something more interesting, something more mature. And so that's really the basis of what I wanted to share with you today. There's your preposition with, and then these three words, pride, courage, and determination, are all objects of that preposition.